She burned down his house thinking she'd won, but when she walked into the courtroom, the judge on the bench was her victim. Subscribe now for more unbelievable HOA stories you won't want to miss. The story begins in a quiet, suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where driveways gleamed from fresh car washes, sprinklers ticked rhythmically across manicured lawns, and neighbors waved politely at each other during morning jogs. From the outside, it looked like the perfect community, safe, orderly, peaceful. But beneath the polished lawns and white picket fences, tension had been brewing for years. At the center of it all was the HOA president, a woman whose name struck a chord of irritation in almost every household. Her name was Karen, and not, just by coincidence, to the neighbors. She embodied every stereotype the nickname carried. She was demanding, confrontational, and power-hungry, wielding the HOA rulebook like a weapon instead of a guideline. People whispered about her late-night patrols, how she would jot down notes on the slightest violations, and how fines appeared in mailboxes like clockwork the moment she spotted something she didn't approve of. Marcus, however, was different. He had lived in the neighborhood for years and kept mostly to himself, a quiet man with a reputation for fairness. Everyone knew he worked as a civil judge at the county courthouse. To most, that fact alone commanded respect. But Karen didn't care. To her, Marcus was just another resident who needed to bow down to her interpretation of the rules. And when she spotted the row of roses he had planted along his walkway, a detail no one else would have thought twice about, she saw her opportunity to assert control. The first move came in the form of a warning letter, typed in formal language and signed with her usual flourish. Karen's letter accused Marcus of violating HOA landscaping regulations. Unauthorized flora, it read coldly, as if the roses were contraband. Most people would have sighed, grumbled, and yanked the flowers out to avoid conflict. But Marcus wasn't most people. He read the letter once, set it aside, and decided he wasn't going to be bullied. Days later, Karen arrived at his doorstep. She didn't knock politely. She pounded, sharp and insistent, until Marcus opened the door. The moment he appeared, she launched into him, her fingers stabbing the air like a weapon. "You think you're above the rules? Not here. This is my neighborhood," she hissed, her voice carrying across the quiet street. The commotion drew attention. Curtains twitched, blinds shifted. Neighbors who had once been targets themselves peered through windows, curious to see who would finally stand up to her. They had seen Karen humiliate families over mailbox colors, scold retirees for leaving recycling bins out too long, and even fine parents for letting their children ride scooters in the cul-de-sac. She thrived on intimidation, and for years, everyone had given in. But Marcus didn't move. He didn't cower or stammer. He stood, tall, his arms crossed, his tone steady as stone. "These rules," he said evenly, "are meant to protect the community, not control it. You're abusing your authority." For a moment, silence hung between them, thick and charged. Karen's lips tightened. She wasn't used to pushback. Most people broke under her stare. But Marcus's calm defiance only fueled her anger. Neighbors whispered from behind glass, excitement mixing with fear. They wanted to cheer Marcus on, but they also knew Karen's wrath. She had a long memory and a vindictive streak. Crossing her meant endless fines, harassment, and in some cases, mysterious complaints filed against you with the county. She didn't just enforce rules. She hunted for ways to trap people in them. For Marcus, though, this wasn't simply about roses anymore. It was about principle. He had spent his life upholding justice, balancing fairness with accountability. He could not stand by while someone turned a system designed for order into a personal kingdom of control. To him, this wasn't just a petty neighborhood spat. It was a miniature version of the power struggles he saw in court every day. Karen, however, didn't see it that way. To her, this was war, and she wasn't going to lose to Marcus or anyone else. She stormed off his porch that afternoon, her heels clicking like gunfire against the pavement, muttering under her breath about setting an example. The neighbors who watched her leave exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen this look before, the look of a woman who wouldn't stop until she had the last word. Marcus returned inside, closing the door quietly, but he knew it wasn't over. A storm was coming. Karen was the type who thrived on escalation. The roses had merely been the spark, but the fire it lit between them was only just beginning. What neither of them knew in that moment was how far this feud would go. What started with flowers would soon lead to flames, real flames that would turn a quiet street into a crime scene. And the same woman who had wagged her finger at Marcus's doorstep would eventually find herself standing in front of him again, not as a neighbor, but as a defendant. Because in the end, it wasn't just about roses, it was about power. And Karen had no idea that this time, she had picked a fight with the one man who understood better than anyone what happens when power is abused. Days turned into weeks, and the feud between Marcus and Karen only grew uglier. It started with small skirmishes. Another letter slipped into his mailbox, another notice of fines taped to his door. Karen claimed his garbage cans weren't aligned properly. His porch light was too bright. His lawn sprinklers ran 2 minutes, longer than allowed. Each accusation was more absurd than the last. Most people would have caved under the constant pressure, but Marcus didn't budge. He had spent his career weighing fairness against injustice, and he knew when rules were being abused. Karen, however, wasn't interested in fairness. She wasn't enforcing rules. She was asserting dominance. To her, the HOA wasn't a system of order, it was a throne, and Marcus's refusal to bow only deepened her obsession. She began watching his house more closely, driving past at odd hours, lingering at the edge of his yard under the guise of inspection. Neighbors noticed her strange behavior but kept quiet, afraid of becoming her next target. Then came the night when everything changed. It was a warm, still evening, the kind where the air felt heavy, and the neighborhood seemed to rest in silence. Families were tucked inside, children asleep in their beds, porch lights casting small halos on trimmed lawns. Marcus and his wife had just gone to bed, their children fast asleep down the hall. The world seemed calm, until it wasn't. A shadow slipped across Marcus's yard, moving with deliberate caution. The soft crunch of gravel underfoot was muffled, but the sound carried in the stillness. A faint metallic clink followed the sound of a gas can being set down. The scent of gasoline began to creep into the night air, sharp and unmistakable, though no one stirred to notice. And then, a sound that would change everything. A soft whoosh as a match caught, followed by a sudden burst of flame. In seconds, Marcus's house was alight. Flames licked up the siding, feeding hungrily on dry wood and paint. The fire spread with terrifying speed, cracking windows, belching smoke that twisted into the sky. The night, once calm and quiet, was now pierced by the roar of fire and the frantic shouts of neighbors spilling onto their lawns. "Call 911, someone screamed. Phones lit up across the street as families rushed to help. Inside, Marcus woke to the sharp sting of smoke in his lungs. He bolted upright, heart pounding as the fire alarms shrieked. His wife shook their children awake, her voice frantic but steady. Get out now." Together, coughing and shielding their mouths, the family stumbled through the smoke, down the stairs, and out into the yard. Just as flames consumed the living room behind them, neighbors gathered, horrified, as firefighters arrived, sirens cutting through the chaos. Water pounded against the blaze, steam hissing into the night, but the fire had already taken its toll. By the time it was under control, Marcus's home was a charred skeleton, smoldering under the glow of red and blue lights. The neighborhood was in shock. People murmured in disbelief, their eyes wide as they pieced together what had happened. Could Karen really have done this? They whispered. The idea seemed unthinkable, but the feud between her and Marcus was no secret. Everyone had seen her rage, her obsession, her threats. It wasn't a stretch to imagine she might have gone too far. And then came the game investigation. Detectives combed the scene while firefighters cooled hot spots. Marcus, still shaken, answered questions as best he could, describing the weeks of harassment leading up to the fire. Neighbors stepped forward too, offering testimony about Karen's hostility, her late-night prowling, her endless vendettas. But it wasn't just words that damned her, it was the evidence. Security cameras from a nearby house had caught her car creeping down Marcus's street just minutes before the fire began. Her license plate glared clearly in the footage. Police executed a search, and what they found left little room for doubt. Karen's clothes, hidden in her garage, still carried the faint odor of gasoline. Tests revealed traces of accelerant soaked into the fabric. An empty red gas can sat tucked behind storage boxes, its spout stained with residue that matched the accelerant used at the fire scene. Every piece of evidence stacked up like bricks on a collapsing wall, each one pointing in the same direction. Karen denied everything. Of course. She sneered when questioned, waving off the accusations as a smear campaign. "This is ridiculous," she scoffed. "They're just trying to make me look bad because I enforce the rules." But her bravado rang hollow. The evidence spoke louder than her excuses. For Marcus, watching the investigation unfold was both surreal and devastating. His home was gone, his family shaken, and the safety of the community shattered. Yet beneath the grief and loss, one truth became clear. Karen's reign of intimidation had crossed a line from nuisance to crime, and though she didn't know it yet, her obsession with control had set her on a path toward the one courtroom where Marcus would not just be her neighbor, but her judge. A week later, the case moved swiftly to court. The fire had left Marcus's home in ruins, his family displaced, and the neighborhood shaken. Yet the most shocking twist was not in the crime itself, but in who would preside over the trial. Fate has a strange way of weaving stories, and this one was laced with irony, almost too sharp to believe. The woman who had tried to destroy Marcus's life was now about to stand before him, in the very place where he wielded authority. His courtroom. The courthouse buzzed with whispers that morning. Reporters lingered on the steps, sensing a story too sensational to ignore. Neighbors filled the benches, some still smelling faintly of smoke from that terrible night. They weren't there for spectacle. They were there because justice mattered. Everyone wanted to see if Karen, the self-styled queen of the HOA, would finally face consequences for the chaos she had sown. Karen arrived late, as if to make an entrance. She swept into the room, wearing a crisp blazer and an air of defiance, chin tilted, eyes scanning the courtroom with a practiced sneer. Her attorney, a weary man who already looked like he regretted taking the case, leaned close to whisper strategy. but Karen brushed him off with a flick of her hand, as though she didn't need him at all. She believed, even now, that she could talk her way out of anything. Her gaze found Marcus across the room. She expected to see a broken man, a neighbor, humbled by loss, someone cowed into silence. Instead, she saw calm authority, the same composure he had shown on his porch weeks earlier when she had tried to belittle him. His posture was straight, his eyes steady, his expression unreadable. And for the first time in her life, Karen felt a crack in her confidence. The clerk's voice rang out, "All rise." The Honorable Judge Marcus, presiding. The shuffle of bodies filled the room as everyone stood. Karen, still smirking faintly, rose as well. But the moment Marcus stepped through the door in his black robe, the smirk faltered. Reality settled over her like a heavy shroud. The man she had taunted, fined, and ultimately tried to destroy was not just her neighbor. He was the judge now presiding over her case. The silence in the room was suffocating. The only sound was the steady tick of the courtroom clock as Marcus took his seat. His gavel tapped lightly, but its echo carried like thunder through the chamber. Bravado wavered, but she clung to it desperately. "This is a conflict of interest," she muttered to her lawyer, her voice sharp and panicked. But her attorney only shook his head. Marcus, by law, had every right to preside. In fact, Karen's actions had guaranteed that he would. Justice wasn't about comfort, it was about accountability. And accountability had finally found her. The trial began, and with it came the unraveling of Karen's carefully constructed facade. Witnesses stepped forward, recounting years of harassment under her leadership. A mother described how Karen found her 4 chalk drawings on the sidewalk. An elderly couple recalled being shamed for leaving their trash can out a few hours late. Each story painted a picture of a woman addicted to control, drunk on the small amount of power she had been given. Then came the evidence from the night of the fire. A firefighter testified about the accelerant that fueled the blaze. A detective presented security footage of Karen's car cruising past Marcus's home moments before the flames erupted. Finally, a forensics expert explained how gasoline residue had been found on her clothing and in her garage. The evidence stacked up like a tower of bricks, and with each layer, Karen's defense crumbled further. She tried to fight back. At one point, she stood abruptly, shouting across the courtroom, "This is all lies. He set me up. He thinks he's untouchable because he's a judge." Her voice cracked with desperation, and murmurs rippled through the crowd. But Marcus remained unmoved. He raised his gavel, the sharp rap demanding silence. And in that single motion, he reminded everyone, including Karen, that this was not her playground. This was his courtroom. The proceedings stretched on, but the outcome was never in doubt. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony damning. Karen's arrogance, once her shield, now revealed her true nature to all, and Marcus, though personally wronged, upheld the dignity of his role. He listened carefully, weighed every word, and refused to let emotion cloud the scales of justice. His calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to Karen's unraveling hysteria. As the final arguments concluded, the courtroom held its breath. Karen sat stiffly at the defense table, her earlier swagger gone. Her hands trembled, fingers twisting at the hem of her blazer. She had walked into this room convinced she could manipulate her way out, as she had done so many times before with neighbors. But now, seated under the gavel of the very man she had tried to destroy, she finally saw the truth. Her power had evaporated. When Marcus delivered the verdict, his voice was steady, measured, but unmistakably resolute. "Karen," he said, his gaze fixed on her, "power is not a license for cruelty. Authority is not an excuse for destruction. The evidence before this court is clear. You abused your position, you endangered lives, and you committed a crime that cannot be excused." The gavel struck. The verdict was guilty. The room erupted. In whispers, neighbors nodding in relief, reporters scribbling furiously, flashes from cameras igniting like lightning. But Karen sat frozen, her face pale, the weight of reality pressing down on her. She had ruled over the neighborhood like a tyrant, but in this courtroom, her reign was over. And Marcus, the man she thought she could intimidate, had not only survived her fire, he had delivered her justice. The proceedings revealed everything. It was as though the courtroom itself had become a stage, and every witness called was another piece of a puzzle Karen had been trying to keep hidden for years. Her history of harassing neighbors, her pattern of abuse as HOA president, and the damning evidence of arson all spilled into the open for the world to hear. Marcus, despite being the victim, never once let emotion cloud his role. Bound by duty and years of experience on the bench, he maintained the professionalism that defined his career. His tone was measured, his questions precise, his demeanor calm. Even as the memories of his burning home flickered in his mind, he listened to testimony with unwavering focus, examined every piece of evidence presented, and gave Karen every possible opportunity to defend herself. But the truth was undeniable. One by one, neighbors stepped forward. A young mother recounted how Karen had fined her for leaving her child's bicycle in the driveway. An elderly man spoke of how she berated him in front of his wife because his mailbox paint had chipped. A teenage boy described being shouted at for skateboarding near the cul-de-sac. These incidents, though petty on their own, painted a chilling portrait when strung together. Karen wasn't a leader, she was a tyrant in a neighborhood she treated like her kingdom. Then came the firefighters, their uniforms still carrying the faint scent of smoke. They testified about the accelerants that fueled the blaze, about how the fire spread unnaturally fast. One firefighter's voice grew heavy as he explained how close Marcus's children had been to being trapped inside. Gasoline, he said firmly, had been poured deliberately. This wasn't negligence, it was arson. The detectives followed, laying out the evidence in methodical detail. The grainy but clear footage of Karen's car on Marcus's street minutes before the fire, the gas can in her garage with residue that matched what was found at the scene, the clothing tucked away in her laundry room that reeked of accelerant. Piece by piece, the puzzle was completed until the picture was unmistakable. And still, Karen tried to fight back when her turn came to speak. She rose from her seat with a defiance that was more desperate than confident. She raised her chin and addressed the room not with humility, but with venom. "I'm the victim here," she cried, her voice shrill. "He disrespected me. He thought he was untouchable because he's a judge. Do you all really believe I'd risk everything just to prove a point?" But her words only confirmed what everyone already knew. This wasn't about roses. It wasn't about mailbox colors or sprinklers or chalk drawings. It was about power. It was about a woman so consumed with control that she would rather burn down a man's house than admit defeat. The neighbors shook their heads. Some whispered among themselves, others crossed their arms in silent judgment. For years, they had endured her tantrums and intimidation. Now, seeing her unravel in a courtroom, they felt both vindicated and horrified. Marcus, seated high above, watched her carefully. His face betrayed nothing, but inside, he felt the gravity of the moment. He had spent years upholding the law, weighing evidence, and handing down verdicts. But never had the stakes been this personal. Never had he had to look into the eyes of someone who had nearly taken everything from him and still remain impartial. He leaned forward slightly, his gavel resting on the bench before him. The room hushed instantly. Even Karen, mid-rant, faltered under the weight of his gaze. "Karen," Marcus began, his voice steady but edged with steel. "This court has heard every witness, examined every piece of evidence, and listened to your defense. What has been revealed here is not the story of a woman enforcing rules, but of a woman abusing power. You did not seek fairness, you sought domination. You did not enforce order, you enforced fear." Karen shifted in her seat, her face pale now, her earlier bravado slipping through her fingers like sand. Marcus continued, his tone unwavering. "The testimony of your neighbors reveals a pattern of harassment and cruelty. The evidence presented by investigators confirms your direct involvement in the crime of arson, and your own words here today show not remorse, but justification for your actions. This was never about community. This was about control." The silence was absolute. Every eye was fixed on him. Reporters' pens hovered above notebooks, neighbors leaned forward in their seats, and Karen gripped the edge of the defense table until her knuckles turned white. Marcus lifted his gavel slightly. "This court finds you guilty of harassment, abuse of authority, and arson. For your actions, you are hereby sentenced to prison, where your power over others will finally end. Let this serve as a reminder that authority is a responsibility, not a weapon. When abused, it will be taken from you." The gavel struck the bench with a crack that echoed through the chamber like thunder. Karen's face crumpled. The mask of arrogance she had worn so proudly shattered in an instant. She sank back into her chair, her mouth opening in shock but no words emerging. For the first time in years, she had nothing to say. The neighbors, watching from the gallery, exchanged glances of relief. Some smiled faintly, others whispered prayers of thanks. Justice had been delivered, not by chance, but by the very man she had underestimated. Marcus set his gavel down and leaned back, exhaling quietly. His voice had carried the same steady tone he had used his entire career. But this time, every word carried a weight that was personal, the weight of a man who had seen justice served not only for himself, but for an entire community finally, free from the grip of one woman's obsession. The sentence was swift. Karen was found guilty of arson, abuse of power, and endangering lives. She was stripped of her HOA position and sentenced to years behind bars. The neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. For the first time in years, they felt free from a reign of intimidation. As reporters gathered outside the courthouse, neighbors spoke of Marcus not just as a judge, but as a man who stood tall in the face of injustice, even when it threatened his own home. Marcus rebuilt what Karen had tried to destroy, not just his house, but the trust of a community that had lived too long under fear. His words echoed in the courtroom and in the hearts of everyone who heard them. Power is not about control, it's about responsibility, and when you abuse it, the law will hold you accountable. Karen learned that lesson the hard way. But the same arrogance that fueled her downfall was now replaced with silence behind prison walls. And in that quiet suburban neighborhood, the roses Marcus planted bloomed brighter than ever.